organization we came across a short time ago ran a groundbreaking pilot study around the use of wearable technology, a pretty fascinating report that I saw. We've asked Mike Weston, the CEO of Profusion, which is a data consultancy, to come up and present that data to you. And I'm not going to take the surprise off this, so I'll let him present it. Please join me in welcoming Mike Weston.
Thank you, Chuck. Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here, and thank you for inviting me to pop over to New York to present these. As you will probably, the more alert amongst you have guessed from the accent, I'm not from around these parts. I've flown over from London for this, and in fact, whoa, hold on. We've lost a couple of, let's go back to the beginning. Yes, so we're a smallish London business with offices in Dubai as well, and one of the things that we categorize ourselves as being is intensely curious about what's happening in the world around us. And as we've seen the explosion of these wearable devices really beginning to gather speed and make it into the consumer mainstream, we felt it was important for us to understand what effect that has and what we might be able to do. Because essentially our business is about being fascinated with what we can understand from data. Let me work on through the slides that we've got here. So, Profusion, we're 56 people in total. 53 of those people are in our London office. The other 3 we've moved out to Dubai just in the course of the last year and set up an office over there. We're a data science consultancy. Now, we come from a marketing background, primarily around CRM work, where we work with some quite large enterprise organizations such as HSBC Bank, across what HSBC call Europe, which seems to start in Bermuda and in Kazakhstan, which is geographically challenging for us people who actually live in something which is off the border of Europe, but we pretend isn't. But there we are. And some large retailers as well. We spend our time trying to understand and help our clients to understand their relationships with people. And by that, yes, clearly marketing is the majority of our work, but it also plays into areas such as organizational design, supply chain. We're helping a telco in the Middle East to determine where they should roll out their 4G networks at the moment, which is a little different, based on location data, and all of that kind of stuff. So the way we describe our business is that we look at a whole range of different data sources, from CRM data through to market basket analysis, RFM, etc. And we try and look to see what we can actually, what insights we can glean from that, so that we can then direct strategy for our clients, and we have a deployment team who can turn that strategy into action. That's essentially what we are. And I describe our 3 core characteristics. I mentioned curiosity at the start. We also talk very strongly about integrity and agility. And those are important, and the reason I mention them is because they're part of the story as to how we came to do this study. As I've already mentioned, we've seen the expansion of wearable devices and how they're hitting the consumer mainstream. And of course, bear in mind, this took place in February, March this year. So this was before the launch of a certain fruit-flavored wearable device, which has had a couple of mentions today already. What we see, what excites us about that is that it gives us access to an unprecedented level of both biometric and very personal data. And so we thought, how can we do something with that? How can we find out what we can get to? How can we persuade a group of people to give us access to some really deep, potentially intrusive data, and have permission to use that to work that into a study? So we did the obvious thing that scientists do when they can't find other guinea pigs to work on. We tested ourselves. So we tested it on the people within our own business. And our hypothesis was that we could use that personal and biometric data to predict behavior. And of course, we're looking at that from, as I said at the start, we're looking at that to see how that influences marketing decisions and what sort of messages we send to people, as well as when we send those out. But also in terms of what impact that has, and I've described this talk as the quantified staff. There's an enormous piece of staff welfare and also optimization of staff work that comes into play with this type of study. So, what did we choose to use? And my apologies to the previous speaker, Travis, that we went for the Fitbit device. Nothing personal, I assure you. It was the strategy behind it was really, really simple. These devices, They cost about $119. I looked it up yesterday over here. They cost about 119 pounds in Britain, but that's the UK economy for you. The reason we chose the Fitbit Charge HR was that it would give us access to heart rate data as well as steps, etc., and we could get that access out on a minute-by-minute basis. And we didn't know if that would matter, but we knew that we wouldn't know if it mattered if we didn't have it. And so that was the determining factor for us. And we also wanted to have everybody who was on the study using the same device so that we had some sense of consistency about it. So the Fitbit Charge HR was the device that we chose. So we took 53 people from our London office. We told them what we were planning to do. We told them just how intrusive we were expecting this trial to be. One of the factors that we wanted to do was to ask people to answer a questionnaire every 3 hours of their waking day, both in work and outside work, including 2 weekends over a 10-day period. So there's a reasonable amount of intrusion going on here. We wanted to examine all of their web browsing behavior, both on desktop, in office, and also on various mobile devices, though they did have the option for private browsing for anything that was personal. So it was a fairly intrusive panel. Of the 53, 31 put their hands up and said, yeah, let's do that. So we went out and we bought 31 of these Charge HR devices. And at the time we compiled the study, we had full data on 24 of those. So before we go too far, I know somebody at some point will ask, if I don't front this out, somebody's going to say, what about statistical viability of the results that I'm presenting? Well, this is a pilot, okay? We haven't got enough here that can make us broad sweeping generalizations about what's happening in the world as a whole. What I think we've got is something which is interesting and which informs how we will then go out and structure the next stages of the research that we do with larger sample sizes. So just a quick hand, you know, I mentioned integrity earlier on, quick hands up on there. We have to be careful how we use this data. So, 24 people. We mapped their routes. Now, I don't know how clearly you can see over here, there's a little yellow dot map pin there in Profusion. We're in an area of London that's called Silicon Roundabout. London being not quite as exciting as California, we have roundabouts instead of valleys. Silicon Roundabout is the hub of something that's called Tech City London, which is where a lot of startup companies, a lot of tech companies operate. It's a good place to be. It's got pretty good communications through to our staff who come in for up to 60 miles to get into work during the day. And we tracked the various different ways they did that, and you can see that mapped out through that path. We thought when we set the trial up, we would be able to get a lot of data of interest from that. What we found is it became incredibly personal. It became very, very quickly easy to identify who people were because we knew where people live, right? So we could try it back. So we stepped back a little bit from this, but we will intend to use this data in more detail for future studies. And there were a couple of things that we did pick up that were around there. When the trial came to a conclusion, you'll have noticed that we had 31 devices, 24 people submitted. We did have some people who turned around during the course of the trial and said, you know what, I'm taking this thing off. I don't want to do this anymore. And there were a couple of reasons that came out for that. We had one guy in particular who said, I'm going to put my hand up to this, Mike. I'm a hypochondriac. And every time my heart rate goes over about 120, I want to go down to A&E and get myself checked out to make sure I'm not having a heart attack. So I don't want to do this anymore because it's making me too nervous. We had other people who conversely found that actually by having access to that data, they were able to better manage their stress. I found that one of the more interesting pieces, one of the things that we hadn't quite predicted would come out of the study, that human interaction piece. And we had a couple of people who said that by being stopped every 3 hours and asked how they were feeling, how stressed they were, what their emotional state was, that it made them more anxious, and so they couldn't wait for the trial to end. So there was a little bit of a sense of some people feeling it was too intrusive. The majority, however, are still wearing these devices today. I sent around a survey last night to the people in my team and said, who's still wearing this, and has it made a difference to your life? One of the slightly more than half who said that they have not had a difference to their life through wearing this device told me this morning that she'd lied, but that she felt uncomfortable with confessing on this, even on a survey like that, that wearing the Fitbit had made her more active. And this person, by the way, is the person who, by a factor of about 2 to 1, is ahead of everyone else in the office in terms of the number of steps that she does per day. And she's using it with an absolute vengeance. She's clocking up at a weekend something in the region of 30,000 steps a day because she's taken this as being something that she's on a personal mission. So we asked people when we set this up not to change their behavior. They couldn't. The fact that they were counting it, counting the steps they were doing, counting their physical activity, made them want to do more. And I think this is in keeping with why companies like Fitbit and Jawbone exist, right? It's to help people become fitter and healthier. And it absolutely happens. And I think there are implications for what we're thinking about with this as to how different people react to things that will have quite a strong impact on what we decide to do. So, some notes. The trial took place for 10 days, from the last weekend in February across through the first weekend of March of this year. So 10-day trial, we wanted 2 weekends. We wanted to stage some events so that we could see group behavior and see how that all worked out. We found some irregularities in device behavior. Memorably, I had one member of the team who called in sick one day, and then about halfway through the day, rang up and said he was slightly nervous because he was looking at his Fitbit, which said that he'd done about 20,000 paces and he hadn't budged from his bed. And he was worried that we were going to track that back to him and take disciplinary action. We didn't, just for the record. But it was interesting. We also saw some irregularities in terms of stuff like heart tracking. It was not perfect, but what it seemed to be was consistent across individuals, which gave us something to work with. But it meant that when we went back and did the data science bit at the end, we had to take those factors into account and adjust our findings accordingly. There is bias in the study. Obviously, there's sample bias. It's 24 people, all of whom we know. Their ages range from 20 through to 60. It's a roughly even male-female split. But obviously, it's a self-selecting study from a sample from a small base. There's a bit of response and measurement bias in there as well. The mood and stress level is self-reported. How stressed do you feel? We put it into 3 buckets. So when we go on to look at some of the stress findings, bear in mind this is self-reported, okay? And so it may not be that one group is more stressed than the other group. It may just be that they're more attuned to the fact that they're stressed than the other group. But I still think this becomes interesting. So, let's dive into some of the water cooler topics that came out of this. We had this wonderful thing. That was the sleep pattern one morning quite early on in the study of one of our team. And we dubbed this the swimming pool for obvious reasons. This person has a clear conscience, I suspect. This person also happens to be the one who is the most physically active, and I wonder if there's some kind of a connection between those two things. She sits next to somebody else who had something that looks a little bit more like a cattle grid. As to what's causing the stress behind that, I don't know. But there was a lot of comparison that was taking place. People were talking a great deal. I found it really interesting that people, to begin with, were more interested in their sleep patterns than they were in the number of steps or flights of stairs that they were climbing or what their heart rates were. So we had a little bit of banter that started taking place in the office around that. When we got to the end of the survey, we started, hold on, let's go back a bit. When we got to the end of the survey, we had a look to see how much sleep people were getting as divided by whether or not they had children and by gender. And we found that quite interesting. So men typically, particularly men with kids, seeming to sleep less than women with kids, or women without kids for that matter. I suspect this is a case where the survey data is being skewed by 1 or 2 particular people within that group. One who has a very young baby who predictably was therefore awake quite a lot. So I think there's a little bit of interplay in that. What we also looked at, though, was the amount of restless and awake time during the course of the night, and again across the same areas. And we found that awake time was reasonably consistent across. But restlessness seemed to play more to people without children, which I found quite surprising. Now, stress. I mentioned that stress is reported here. Whoa. Let's get back into that. So what we're looking at here is 3 different ranges of stress levels, from low, mid to high, and to high. And then we're looking to see how that affects calorie burn. And on the next chart, we're looking to see how that affects the amount of activity. What was really interesting is that the people who were the most stressed were the people who had the least physical activity. Or rather, when stressed, people had the least physical activity. So does that indicate, perhaps, that when we're under stress, we tend to do less? Certainly, our calorie count and our heart count changes accordingly. Ooh, now that's not quite the way that was meant to render. I think that's a little clearer. Okay, so theaters of emotion. What we're talking about here, and in fact, you'll forgive me for pausing for a second. There was another chart that sat behind that which has not come through. One of the things that we looked at was the way in which people responded through stress levels based on the survey that we did, according to the activities that they were taking. What was interesting in that, in particular, was that where you might have thought that calorie count and stress count would be affected by activities such as going to the gym is actually really low in terms of calorie count compared to events that people were going to. And it turned out that a number of people had been to a concert where their stress level was quite low, they were in a happy place, but at the same time, they were in a place where their calorie count, their calorie burn was extremely high. I think we can probably deduce what was going on there. So we played that one through as well. So where does this take us to? As I said at the start, this is an early study, and we're using this as a template to think about what we do from here. What I find really interesting is I'm saying that half of our respondents, half of our 24, are still Fitbitting. Actually, the truth of the matter is, of the other half of them didn't reply. So the number could well be significantly higher. The Fitbit is still very much part of Profusion's culture today, and it's still getting talked about just as much. And about half the people who used the Fitbit felt that it had changed the way that they were active. Of those who didn't, I had a couple of comments, such as my colleague who's with me here today, Damien, at the back here, who commented that he wishes it had made more of a difference, feels a little bit guilty about that, and plans at some point in the future to put it on more often and do more of that. One of the other things that we found is that one of the people who knows a number of us at Profusion is doing a talk today as well, and his talk is around about the things that irritate him. And fairly high up on his list of things that irritate him is people using Fitbits and talking about how their heart rate and sleep rates go. So we obviously make quite a lot of noise about this, right? So we've managed to alienate people who are outside the trial. That said, for the next range of trials that we'll go to, we've got a number of clients that we're talking to who are particularly interested in including their teams as part of this trial. Potentially including one of those financial institutions that I mentioned earlier on, who are thinking about using them on employees in branch as a way of measuring how people are in terms of dealing with stressful situations, which is important from an HR perspective, so we can monitor stress levels with those people. But also what impact that has on their conversion rates and ability to sell. We're already doing some work with call center data at the moment, where we're finding certain people in call center who have better conversion rates for types of people based on sentiment expressed in what they're doing. We're doing some work around that. We think we might be able to make a link between that and what's happening on these types of devices as well. So that's one of the areas that we'll be exploring for next stages on. So staff wellness programs are high on the list of things that have become increasingly interesting to us as a result of doing this study. We're also looking at what impact that has on marketing and targeting. And one of the things that we found during the study is that we have a much more limited range of emotions at work than we do at home, which has some interesting implications for how we target messages for people across those two different environments. In particular, we only had 2 shades of anger when we were at work. when we were cross about something, it came down to just two things. When we were at home, it was far more nuanced, and we felt things like disrespected and underappreciated and things like that at home in a way that we didn't appear to at work, which we found interesting. The final point around it is to do with the ethical impact. And it's become a bit of a talking point over the last week. There's a company over here in the US called Intermex, which is getting sued by an employee who was using or being instructed to use a tracking device on her mobile phone. And she felt that that was overly intrusive, and so she took the step of uninstalling it. And she was at first scolded and then fired. So she's suing her employers for that, which is a really interesting one. The level of intrusiveness that we can get to with these devices is very, very high. And we need to make sure we get that contract right between us and our employees or whoever it is that we're monitoring with the Fitbit data or whichever wearable data we're using, so that it's done on a consensual basis. And if we don't, we're going to find ourselves getting into a bit of legal turmoil here. And I think that's the legal landscape's different from one territory to another. But I think that finding is something that is going to be reasonably consistent across the two. And so some of the softer things that we found as we've gone through the trial, I think actually are some of the more rich areas for exploring in the stages that we go on to from there. So that's the findings as I've got to present to you today. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. As I say, my name is Mike Weston. There's my contact details up there. Happy to take any questions now, or if anybody wants to get in touch later, happy to hear from you.